everybody. Welcome to week 14, where we're looking at advanced applications of reinforcement and motivating operations. I'm going to keep it really short this week and just give you a bit of a guide for what the reading and viewing will what you can learn from the reading and viewing, and kind of some ways to approach it too. So what we've talked about so far are basic concepts in behavior analysis, and we know that the basic principles of behavior analysis that everybody talks about are reinforcement, punishment, stimulus, control, and extinction. But then things that we've talked about this semester include motivating operations, and remembering that motivating operations are going to affect both reinforcement and punishment, and that schedules and parameters of reinforcement and punishment also will have similar effects on behavior. Then lastly, all of those other items that I just talked about are aspects of operant conditioning, and respondent conditioning is also responsible for behavior. Basically, you want to be able to discuss some of these variables for any behavioral concept, event, article you read, intervention you are utilizing. And honestly, anywhere that human or animal behavior occurs, you should be able to break it down into and to identify or tact some of these variables. That's pretty much the point that we want to get to at this point. So this whole module has concentrated on looking at these concepts with some more advanced applications. Last week you learned about behavioral economics and discounting, which really makes use of all of the areas, all of the concepts within operant conditioning. This week you're going to read about a number of different analyses and interventions that will incorporate the different aspects of operant conditioning. So what you want to be able to do is to first identify where the difference is. Are we talking about antecedent interventions? Are we talking about talking about interventions based on consequences? Where is the difference? How is it different than a standard analysis of some type of behavior, or what people may consider as a traditional analysis? And what is different about that consequence or antecedent variable? Remembering that consequences can come in many forms, antecedents can come in many forms. But the first thing you want to be able to do is this something that affects behavior because of what happens before it? Or is this something that affects behavior because of something that happens after it? Again, as a lot of this semester has been, it seems like we're breaking things down into really simple components, but that's what makes the complex analysis complex, is that it's built on all of the foundation skills. So you need to be able to break down concepts and complex conceptualizations of why and how behavior occurs down to the building blocks. And we start with the basic three-term contingency, knowing that we're also going to consider motivating operations and extra variables, extra sources of stimulus control in the form of contextual and conditional stimuli, and potential extinction effects, potential side effects of reinforcement and or punishment. All of those come back to these basic building blocks. So let's look at some of the different things that you're going to read or hear about this week. First is conditioned reinforcers. And specifically, you're going to learn a bit about tag teaching, which is a really cool process in which auditory stimuli are conditioned as reinforcers to teach different skills. The reason that this is something that's particularly of interest is that auditory stimuli can be delivered at any time and can be contingent on really discrete responses. So you think about it, in order for me to reinforce a behavior using something like money, right? The behavior occurs and I need to somehow make the delivery of money a stimulus change. So it needs to be an energy change that the behavior can contact through its receptor cells, meaning they need to see it, hear it, smell it, taste it, or feel it. Most likely with money, we're going with sight. So if they're engaging in certain behaviors, they need to be able to see the money delivery. Sometimes in order to make sure that that stimulus change occurs for the behavior, they engage in different behaviors. So it's not necessarily the exact response that we're looking at that is reinforced. For instance, if you are teaching someone to engage in some type of imitation, for instance, clapping their hands, they may engage in hand clapping, and then you hand them a token. Technically, the response that's being reinforced may be the reaching for the token, if the feel of the token is what's reinforcing the behavior. With auditory stimuli, you can make sure that that auditory stimulus happens while the behavior is happening. There have been a number of different applications of tag teaching. There have been applications with dancers, with people using kettlebells, and what is being reinforced are really discrete muscle movements in the form of some type of correct positioning. So when you think about or are learning more about tag teaching, you want to be paying attention to that consequence and how the consequence is implemented and how it relates to the behavior where the contingency is, right? What you're also looking at is those schedules and parameters of the reinforcer and how it may have a different effect on behavior because of the dimension or the sense that is receiving that consequence. Another thing that you're going to read about is automatic reinforcement. And by now, you know that automatic reinforcement occurs when the response itself, or behavior obviously, or the response product is what reinforces behavior. A lot of times when people think about reinforcement, they think about self-stimulatory behavior or self-injurious behavior that has been automatically reinforced. Potentially some type of vocalizations, some type of self-stimulatory, meaning maybe hand flapping or jumping, many different behaviors that people who have worked with individuals with autism spectrum disorders may have experienced. However, many behaviors are automatically reinforced, and that's what you want to consider. The article that you're going to read this week is talking about how sound may automatically reinforce what typically would be considered language development. So what you want to really be thinking about when you're reading this article, same thing, is paying attention to that consequence and how would the stimulus automatically reinforce behavior, and how the authors are suggesting that behavior would be reinforced and shaped up. It's a really interesting concept, but you need to be paying attention to automatic reinforcement and really what the suggestion is. So paying attention to the consequence and how the effect on behavior may occur. You also will potentially think about how these reinforcers are conditioned, right? Moving back to the last concept we were just talking about. Really important. Another concept, an advanced topic that you're going to talk about is non-contingent reinforcement, which you may have talked about in other classes. For non-contingent reinforcement, you really want to consider whether or not you're talking about reinforcement. Non-contingent reinforcement is also called time-based schedules of reinforcement. So it's where a stimulus that has reinforced behavior in the past is delivered based on the passage of time, meaning not contingent on behavior. If we think about this, it's a bit ironic and a bit misleading because by definition, reinforcement is contingent. So we want to really pay attention to what's happening when we're talking about non-contingent reinforcement. So are we actually talking about a consequence intervention or something based on antecedents? And I'm going to let you know right now that we're looking at the antecedents. It's looking at the effect on behavior based on non-contingent delivery of a preferred stimulus. This is an antecedent intervention. What happens to behavior when this antecedent intervention is in place? You want to also think about what antecedent stimuli are being changed. Is it the SD? Is it the conditional stimulus? Is it motivating operations? Non-contingent reinforcement works. These procedures work in decreasing behaviors of interest. However, why does it work? And that's what you want to think about. Make sure that you can break things into the contingencies. But you're looking at the antecedents with non-contingent reinforcement. Here we get to our first lecture checking question. Why is the term NCR, or non-contingent reinforcement, misleading? Take a second and choose your answer. I hope everybody picked C. So I kind of basically used the exact words where non-contingent reinforcement is misleading because reinforcement by definition is contingent. In order for behavior to increase based on reinforcement, the stimulus change occurs contingent on responding. The other answers are just incorrect. So there's no need to go through them, but you want to be thinking about this. The other thing that you want to consider is non-contingent reinforcement also results in the decrease of behavior, and by definition, non-contingent reinforcement results in decrease of target behaviors. Let's do one more. You're going to read a pretty complex article by Carbone and colleagues that suggests an alternate analysis of a number of different treatments based on the analysis of the CMOR. We reviewed the CMOR in week 8, so if you need to review it, that's where I would go. However, Carbone provides a nice tutorial in the beginning of the article as well. But remember with the CMOR, what we're considering is that because of a history where a warning stimulus or a stimulus is repeatedly presented prior to an aversive stimulus, that warning stimulus will become a CMOR and it will evoke behavior that's been followed by its own termination in the past, and the termination will negatively reinforce behavior. So when we're looking at the CMOR, we're obviously looking at antecedents in the terms of motivating operations. What Carbone and colleagues provide is a really comprehensive example of a number of different instructional strategies to abolishing the CMOR in order to increase the probability of students with autism engaging in learning behavior. Their suggestion is that many stimuli related to instruction for students with autism can become CMORs, and that different strategies can be utilized to abolish those, abolish the CMOR. The thing here is not only do you need to pay attention to the fact that there are antecedent interventions and that the antecedents are what are being manipulated, but you need to break everything down into the different paradigms. If I can give you one suggestion for your career in behaviorism at all, it is to, whenever you read anything about an event, an intervention, a procedure, a conceptualization, you need to be able to break it down into the conditioning paradigms. So if you determined, or if it's stated that something is based on operant conditioning, you first need to be able to, one, tact the behavior. That's absolutely crucial. A lot of times with complex analyses, there are so many behaviors of interest, or so many behaviors that are described within a certain scenario, that the behavior of interest is not 100% apparent. So first be able to detect the behavior, then be able to detect the consequence. right? Is it reinforcement? Is it punishment? Is there some type of extinction procedure in place? What is the schedule? What are the parameters? What is the suggested effect on behavior? That's very important. These are going to be your basics. And then you need to look at the different antecedent conditions. One, it's absolutely imperative that with every operant conditioning example, you can tack that SD. If there is not an apparent SD, then your interpretation of the example may not be correct. Then, once you have your three-term contingency, you want to look at the potentials for motivating operations and additional sources of control. Remembering that there may be many, many variables that it's been suggested by Ted Carr that there could be a 4 or more term contingency, 5-term contingency, 6-term contingency, where each of your examples or each of your conditional stimuli will fall within brackets. And the contingency itself will only be in effect if there's another stimulus present. With your motivating operations, it's important to use any of the paradigms that we discussed. If there's a CMOR, if there's a CMOS, if there's a CMOT, you need to be able to tack the variables, or else you may be misunderstanding the concept or the explanation. The same thing applies to responding conditioning. If there's a suggested respondent effect in place, you should be able to tack the original neutral stimulus. That becomes the conditioned stimulus, the conditioned response, whether or not that conditioned response is the same as the original unconditioned response that had been elicited by the unconditioned stimulus. In more recent articles, it's been suggested that the unconditioned response and the conditioned response may not be the same as Pavlov had suggested more than 100 years ago. But you need to be able to identify all of these different variables, or else your understanding of what's being discussed may be a little skewed. Like I said, if I can give you any advice when looking at the articles for this week, the articles for next week, and just your career in the future, it's to be able to break it down into the paradigms. So that brings us to our last check-in question. I hope I've emphasized this pretty clearly, but in order to test whether or not you understand a behavioral concept, intervention, article, or event, what should you do? And honestly, I was pretty much hoping that this could have been a fill-in and that everybody would have said, draw out the paradigms. Be able to identify the different variables and how they go together. All right, like I said, this was a quick lecture. I hope you enjoy the material for this week, and we will look at even more applications next week, where we're looking at different applications beyond autism. So you're going to read about gambling and football and substance abuse and a number of different things. So I hope you're looking forward to it, and have a great week.